Have you ever realized that the person who knows you best has been standing right beside you all along? Clara Reyes placed the freshly brewed coffee on Ethan Mercer's desk at exactly 7:15 in the morning, just as she had done every weekday for the past 3 years. The Seattle rain streaked down the floor-to-ceiling windows of his home office, turning the city below into a watercolor of gray and silver. She noticed he hadn't touched his breakfast again, the poached eggs growing cold beside a stack of contracts that seemed to multiply overnight. The morning light filtered through the clouds in that particular way it did in the Pacific Northwest, soft and diffused, making everything look like it existed inside a pearl. "You need to eat," she said, straightening the papers he'd scattered across the mahogany surface. Her voice carried the gentle firmness she'd perfected over 3 years of managing this household, and, whether he acknowledged it or not, managing him. "The eggs are exactly how you like them. 6 minutes, runny center." Ethan didn't look up from his laptop. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the same relentless precision that had built Mercer Technologies from a garage startup into a company valued at $4 billion. "I'll get to it. You said that yesterday, and the day before." Clara picked up the plate and held it directly in his line of vision, forcing him to acknowledge her existence. The ceramic was warm against her palms, the eggs perfectly cooked despite the fact that he never seemed to appreciate them. "Mr. Mercer, I've been working in this house long enough to know when you're running on fumes. Eat." He finally met her eyes, and something in his chest shifted, the way it always did when Clara decided to challenge him. Most people in his life, board members, investors, even his own family, treated him with a careful deference that bordered on fear. They saw the success, the money, the reputation for ruthless efficiency, and they backed down before any confrontation could begin. Clara had never received that memo. From her first day in this house, she'd treated him like a human being rather than a balance sheet, and he'd never quite figured out how to respond to that. "Fine." He took the plate from her hands, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact lasted less than a second, but he felt it echo through him in ways he didn't want to examine. "Happy now?" "Thrilled." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. The morning light caught the dark waves of her hair, pulled back in its usual practical ponytail. "Oh, Mr. Mercer, I need to let you know. Tomorrow I'll be arriving late, around 10 instead of 7. Ethan's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. In 3 years, Clara had never once been late. She'd shown up during snowstorms that had paralyzed the city, during the transit strike of 2022, when she'd walked 4 miles to reach his house. Even the morning after her sister's wedding, when she'd probably had 3 hours of sleep and still managed to arrive with fresh pastries from that bakery he liked in Capitol Hill. Her reliability was so absolute that he'd stopped thinking about it, the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat until something makes it skip. "Is everything all right?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. He was aware, suddenly, of how much he didn't know about her life outside these walls. She existed for him in the context of this house, efficient, competent, always present. And he'd never bothered to wonder what she did when she left each evening, who she spent time with, what made her laugh when no one was paying her to be pleasant. Clara smiled, and it was different from her usual professional pleasantness. This smile had a secret in it, something soft and private that made Ethan suddenly aware of the distance between them. Not the physical distance across his office, but the vast gulf of assumption and ignorance that separated employer from employee. "Everything's fine. I have a date." She said it simply, as if she were announcing a dentist appointment or a change in the grocery delivery schedule. And then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the hallway toward the kitchen. Ethan sat frozen, the eggs cooling on his plate for the second time that morning. A date. Clara had a date. He set down his fork, his appetite vanishing entirely. The logical part of his brain, the part that had analyzed market trends and calculated risks with ruthless precision for 2 decades, the part that had made him wealthy beyond any reasonable measure, pointed out that Clara Reyes was a 34-year-old woman with every right to a personal life. She was attractive, with her warm brown skin and dark eyes that seemed to see everything, intelligent in ways that went far beyond her job description, and warm in a way that made everyone around her feel seen and valued. Of course she dated. Of course men asked her out. The fact that Ethan had never considered this before said more about his own obliviousness than anything else, but logic had nothing to do with the feeling currently twisting through his stomach. He stood abruptly, walking to the window and staring out at the rain. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. 43 years old, dark hair silvering at the temples, the permanent furrow between his brows that his mother always said made him look angry even when he wasn't. When had he become this person? This man who lived alone in a house too big for one, who worked 16-hour days not because he needed the money anymore, but because he didn't know what else to do with himself. Sarah had been gone for 5 years now. 5 years since the car accident on a rainy night, not unlike this one, since the phone call from the hospital that had split his life into before and after. They'd been married for 12 years, together for 15, and losing her had been like losing a limb. He'd learned to function without her, but he'd never stopped feeling the phantom pain of her absence. He'd thrown himself into work, into building something that would outlast his grief, and somewhere along the way he'd stopped living entirely. His house was spotless because Clara kept it that way. His meals were prepared, his dry cleaning picked up, his life running like a well-oiled machine, all because of a woman he'd never thought to really see. Ethan pressed his palm against the cold glass of the window, watching the rain trace patterns down its surface. Who was taking Clara on a date tomorrow? Where were they going? Was it someone she'd met online, or through friends, or at one of the community events she mentioned attending on her weekends off? Would he make her laugh the way she sometimes laughed when she thought Ethan wasn't listening? That full, unguarded sound that seemed to fill the entire house with warmth. He turned back to his desk, picked up his phone, and pulled up Clara's employee file. He'd hired her through an agency 3 years ago, right when he was falling apart after Sarah's death, and couldn't manage to feed himself, let alone maintain a household. The house had been a disaster. Dishes piling up, laundry forgotten, the garden Sarah had loved turning brown and wild with neglect. The agency had sent 3 candidates before Clara, and none of them had lasted more than a week. One had quit after Ethan snapped at her for rearranging his books. Another had been let go for selling stories about his grief to a tabloid journalist. A third had simply stopped showing up, leaving a note saying she couldn't work for someone so determined to destroy himself. Clara had been different from the moment she walked through his door. Her resume had been impressive. Previous experience with several prominent Seattle families, excellent references, a degree in hospitality management from Portland State that she'd never had the chance to use. But what had struck him during the interview was her directness. She hadn't fawned over his money or his reputation. She hadn't offered empty condolences about his wife or tiptoed around him like he might shatter at any moment. She'd simply asked what he needed and then set about providing it, with a quiet competence that had become the backbone of his daily existence. The file told him nothing about her personal life. No emergency contact except a sister named Maria who lived in Portland. No mentioned partners, no social media links, nothing that would explain who might be taking her out tomorrow, or why the thought of it made Ethan feel like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He closed the file, disgusted with himself. He was her employer, not her keeper. What Clara did on her own time was none of his business. He had a board meeting in 2 hours, a product launch to oversee, a company that employed 1,500 people, depending on him to keep his head in the game. He sat back down at his desk and tried to focus on work. The words on his screen blurred together, meaningless. All he could think about was that smile, the secret one, the one she'd never shown him before. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Ethan went through the motions, the meetings, the calls, the endless stream of decisions that required his attention, but part of his mind remained stuck on that morning conversation. He found himself listening for Clara's movements through the house, tracking her presence the way he never had before. The sound of the vacuum cleaner in the living room, the clatter of dishes being loaded into the dishwasher, the soft melody she hummed while she worked, something in Spanish that he'd heard 1,000 times without ever really hearing it. He realized, with a jolt of shame, that he didn't even know if she spoke Spanish fluently or if the humming was just fragments remembered from childhood. He didn't know where her family was from originally, whether her parents were still alive, what she dreamed about doing if she ever left this job. He'd spent 3 years in close proximity to this woman, and he knew almost nothing about her beyond her professional capabilities. At 6 o'clock, Clara appeared in his office doorway with her coat on and her bag over her shoulder. The rain had stopped, and the late afternoon light made her look softer somehow, less like his efficient housekeeper, and more like a woman with a life waiting for her beyond these walls. "Dinner's in the warming drawer," she said. "Chicken piccata, roasted vegetables, that sourdough bread you like from Pike Place. Don't let it sit there until midnight this time." "I won't." She nodded, satisfied, and turned to go. "Clara." She looked back, eyebrows raised in question. Her hand was already on the front door handle, ready to step out into the evening, into whatever life she'd built that didn't include him. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. What was he going to say? "Don't go on your date tomorrow. Stay here with me instead, eating chicken piccata and pretending that this strange domestic arrangement we've built is something more than employment. Cancel your plans because I've suddenly realized, after 3 years of barely noticing you exist, that the thought of you with someone else makes me feel like I can't breathe." "Have a good evening," he said finally. "You too, Mr. Mercer." The front door closed behind her, and the house fell silent in a way it never did when Clara was there. Ethan remained at his desk, staring at the spot where she'd stood, wondering when everything had become so complicated. He didn't sleep well that night. The rain returned around midnight, a steady drumming against the windows that usually lulled him into unconsciousness, but tonight only seemed to amplify the silence of the empty house. His bed felt larger than usual, the king-sized expanse of it mocking him with its emptiness. He kept thinking about Clara, not as his housekeeper, not as the efficient professional who kept his life running smoothly, but as a woman. A woman who laughed when she thought no one was listening. A woman who challenged him when everyone else backed down. A woman who had been standing right beside him for 3 years while he was too blind, too buried in his own grief, to notice. He thought about Sarah, too. About the life they'd built together in this house, the plans they'd made for a future that would never happen. They'd talked about children, about traveling the world together when they retired, about growing old in this house with grandchildren running through the garden. Now the nursery they'd been preparing stood empty behind a closed door, and the garden was maintained by a landscaping service that came twice a month to keep things tidy without any of the love Sarah had poured into every flower bed. Would Sarah want him to move on? She'd always been pragmatic about such things, dismissive of the romantic notion that grief should last forever. "If something happens to me," she'd said once, early in their marriage, "I want you to find someone else. I want you to be happy." He'd laughed it off at the time, certain that nothing would ever happen to either of them, that they had decades stretching out ahead of them like an endless summer. Now, lying alone in the dark, he wondered if he'd ever truly be capable of happiness again. And he wondered, with a guilt that felt like acid in his chest, whether Clara might be part of what that happiness could look like. By the time morning came, Ethan had reached a decision. He wasn't sure it was the right one, but he was sure he couldn't spend another day pretending that yesterday's conversation hadn't changed something fundamental in how he saw the world. He was waiting in the kitchen when Clara arrived, early, despite her announcement that she'd be late. "Mr. Mercer." She stopped short in the doorway, clearly surprised to find him there. He was usually in his office by now, already deep into emails and conference calls, leaving her to manage the house in peace. "I wasn't expecting you to be up." "I couldn't sleep." He gestured to the coffee maker, which was sputtering through the final stages of brewing. "I made a pot. It's probably terrible. I can never remember the ratio you use." Clara approached the counter cautiously, as if he were a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. She set down her bag, hung up her jacket, and poured herself a cup with the measured movements of someone trying to figure out what was happening. She took a sip and managed to keep a straight face, though Ethan could tell from the slight tightening around her eyes that he'd gotten the ratio spectacularly wrong. "It's fine," she said diplomatically. "It's awful. I can see it on your face." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, breaking through her professional composure. "It's a little strong. A little strong, or could strip paint off the walls. Somewhere in between." She set the cup down and started pulling ingredients from the refrigerator, falling into her morning routine with practiced ease. Eggs, butter, the fresh herbs she kept in a jar on the windowsill. "Is everything all right? You're not usually down here this early." Ethan watched her crack eggs into a bowl, her movements fluid and certain. She had beautiful hands, he noticed, strong and capable, with short practical nails and a thin silver ring on her right hand that he'd never paid attention to before. "I wanted to talk to you. Before you leave for your appointment." "My date, you mean?" Clara glanced at him over her shoulder, that secret smile playing at her lips again. "You can say the word, Mr. Mercer. It won't bite." "Your date." The word felt strange in his mouth, weighted with meaning he couldn't quite name. "Who is he?" Clara's hands stilled on the whisk. For a long moment she didn't move, and Ethan could see the tension in the line of her shoulders, the careful stillness of someone deciding how to respond to an unexpected question. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "The man you're meeting. Who is he?" She turned to face him fully, her expression shifting from surprise to something more guarded. The morning light caught her features, the high cheekbones, the full mouth, the intelligence in her dark eyes. She was beautiful, he realized. Not in the polished, obvious way of the women who showed up at his business events, but in a way that was real and warm and entirely her own. "With respect, Mr. Mercer, I'm not sure that's any of your business." "You're right. It's not." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration and embarrassment warring in his chest. He felt like a fool, standing here in his own kitchen interrogating his housekeeper about her personal life. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I asked that. Forget I said anything." But Clara didn't move to resume her cooking. She stood there, studying him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through every wall he'd built around himself. The silence stretched between them, filled with questions neither of them was asking. "His name is David," she said quietly. "David Chen. He's a physical therapist at the clinic where my sister works in Portland. Maria's been trying to set us up for months, and I finally agreed to have coffee with him when he's in town for a conference." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "Why do you want to know?" Ethan couldn't answer her. He couldn't explain the tightness in his throat, the irrational surge of something that felt dangerously close to jealousy. He was her employer. He had no right to feel anything about her personal life, no claim on her beyond the salary he deposited into her account every 2 weeks. The power imbalance alone made his feelings inappropriate, regardless of what they might be. "I should let you get ready," he said, stepping back toward the door. "I hope you have a good time." He was almost to the hallway when Clara's voice stopped him. "Mr. Mercer, Ethan." It was the first time she'd ever used his first name, the sound of it in her voice, soft, questioning, uncertain, made him turn around despite every instinct telling him to keep walking. "Why do you care who I'm going to coffee with?" The question hung in the air between them, demanding an answer he wasn't prepared to give. Ethan looked at her. Really looked. The way he should have been looking for the past 3 years. And saw not his housekeeper, but a woman standing in his kitchen with egg-streaked hands, and a cautious hope in her eyes that terrified him, because it suggested she might already know the answer. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know why I care, but I do." Clara was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, as if he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Eat your breakfast, Ethan. I'll be back by noon." She turned back to the stove, and Ethan retreated to his office, his heart pounding with something that felt dangerously like possibility. The morning crawled by with agonizing slowness. Ethan tried to work, but every few minutes his eyes drifted to the clock on his computer screen, tracking the time until Clara's return. 10 o'clock passed, then 11, then 11:30. He imagined her sitting across from David Chen in some trendy Seattle coffee shop, laughing at his jokes, enjoying his company. David was probably handsome. Physical therapists usually were, all that time spent in gyms and athletic facilities. Probably charming, too. Probably didn't have a dead wife haunting his dreams, or a house full of rooms he couldn't bear to enter. The jealousy was irrational, and Ethan knew it. He had no claim on Clara, no right to feel possessive about where she went or who she saw. She was his employee, nothing more. The fact that she'd become the most constant presence in his life over the past 3 years didn't change the fundamental nature of their relationship. And yet... At 11:45, Ethan heard the front door open. He was on his feet before he could stop himself, walking toward the entryway with a casualness he didn't feel. Clara was hanging up her coat, her expression unreadable. She looked the same as always, professional, composed, put together, but there was something different in the set of her shoulders, some tension that hadn't been there when she'd left. "How was it?" he asked, then immediately wished he could take the question back. Clara turned to face him, and for a moment he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or something more complicated. "It was nice. David's a nice man." "That's good. I'm glad." "He asked me to dinner next weekend." She paused, watching his reaction with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "I said I'd think about it." The relief that flooded through Ethan was so intense, it nearly knocked him off his feet. She hadn't said yes. She hadn't committed to a second date. There was still time. For what, he wasn't sure. But there was still time. "Mr. Mercer." Clara's voice was gentle now, the way it got when she was about to tell him something he didn't want to hear. "Ethan, I've worked in this house for 3 years. I know every room, every corner, every ghost that you're carrying around with you. I know you loved your wife. I know losing her almost destroyed you. But she's been gone for 5 years, and you're still living like you died with her." Ethan felt the words land like physical blows, each one striking a truth he'd been avoiding since the night Sarah's heart stopped beating on an operating table while he sat helpless in a waiting room. "I'm not—" "Yes, you are." Clara stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the coffee on her breath and the faint floral scent of her shampoo. Jasmine, he realized now. She always smelled like jasmine. "You work until you can't see straight. You eat because I put food in front of you. You exist, Ethan, but you're not living. And I've watched it happen, day after day, for 3 years. And I've wanted to say something, but it wasn't my place. I was just the housekeeper." "You were never just the housekeeper." The words came out before Ethan could stop them, raw and honest in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in years. Clara's eyes widened slightly, and he realized with a jolt of fear that he'd said too much, revealed too much, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "That was inappropriate. You work for me. I shouldn't have—" "Ethan." Clara reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his cold skin. The contact sent a shock through his system, electricity and comfort intertwined. I didn't say no to David because I wasn't interested. I said I'd think about it because I needed to know something first. What? I needed to know if the way you looked at me this morning meant what I thought it meant. She held his gaze, steady and unafraid. Did it? Ethan looked down at their joined hands, at her slender fingers intertwined with his. He thought about Sarah, about the life they'd built together, and the future they'd planned before it was stolen from them. He thought about the past 5 years, the emptiness and the grief and the slow deadening of everything that used to make him feel alive. And then he thought about Clara, the way she challenged him when everyone else backed down, the way she hummed while she worked, filling the house with music she probably didn't realize she was making, the way she'd made this house feel like a home again, even when he wasn't ready to live in one. Yes, he said. It meant exactly what you thought it meant. Clara's face broke into a smile. Not the secret one from yesterday, but something brighter and more open, something that made Ethan's chest ache with a feeling he'd thought he'd buried alongside his wife. Well then, she said, I guess we have a lot to talk about. They did talk, that afternoon and into the evening, sitting in the kitchen that Clara had made the heart of the house. The rain had returned, a gentle patter against the windows that seemed to create a cocoon around them, separating them from the rest of the world. Ethan told her about Sarah, really told her, not the sanitized version he shared with colleagues and distant relatives at holiday gatherings, but the whole truth. How they'd met in college at Stanford, 2 awkward engineering students who'd bonded over a shared hatred of their thermodynamics professor and a mutual love of terrible science fiction movies. How she'd made him laugh, made him feel seen in a way no one else ever had, made him believe that he could be more than just a brain running calculations. How she'd supported him through the early years of building his company, through the failures and near bankruptcies, and moments when he'd wanted to give up. He told Clara about the night Sarah died, about the phone call he'd been in the middle of when she left for the grocery store, the work emergency that had kept him from going with her the way he usually did, about the drunk driver who'd run a red light, and the trauma surgeon who'd come out of the operating room with that look on his face that said everything before words could. About the funeral, the well-meaning condolences, the way people had treated him like he was made of glass for months afterward. I kept waiting to feel better, he said, staring into his coffee cup. It had gone cold hours ago, but neither of them had moved to make more. Everyone said time would help, but it didn't. The grief just became normal, like background noise. I stopped expecting to feel anything else. Clara was silent for a long moment, her hand still in his. Then she told him about herself, about growing up in Portland with a single mother who cleaned houses for wealthy families, who came home exhausted every night with stories about people who had everything and still weren't happy, about watching her mother sacrifice everything so that Clara and her sister could have opportunities she'd never had, about the degree she'd earned and the career she'd planned, hotel management, eventually her own boutique property somewhere, and how it had all fallen apart when her mother got sick and Clara had become the breadwinner at 22. I took whatever jobs I could get, she said, waitressing, housekeeping, anything that paid. And then Mom died and Maria was still in school and I just kept going. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd get back on track eventually. And then years went by and here I am, 34 years old, and I'm still cleaning someone else's house. Clara, I'm not complaining, she said quickly. This is a good job. You're a good employer mostly, when you're not forgetting to eat and working yourself to death. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. But I was going to leave, you know. After the first year, I had an interview lined up at a hotel downtown, a management position that would have put me back on track toward what I actually wanted to do. What happened? Clara smiled ruefully. You happened. You were such a mess, Ethan. You barely ate, barely slept, barely functioned. And I couldn't. I couldn't just leave you like that. It felt wrong, like abandoning someone who needed help, even if they were too stubborn to ask for it. So you stayed because you felt sorry for me? No. She squeezed his hand. I stayed because somewhere along the way, taking care of you stopped feeling like a job. It started feeling like something I wanted to do. And that scared me, because you were my employer, and you were grieving, and I didn't think you'd ever be ready to see me as anything other than part of the furniture. Ethan stared at her, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he knew about their relationship. For 3 years, he'd seen Clara as a fixture of his household, as necessary and unremarkable as the walls themselves. He'd never stopped to wonder what she thought, what she felt, what she might want from her own life. I've been a terrible employer, he said. You've been a grieving widower. There's a difference. Not much of one. Clara laughed, and the sound filled the kitchen like music, like light, like everything he'd been missing without knowing it. Maybe not, she agreed. But you're noticing now. That's what matters. The next few weeks were a strange dance of discovery. Ethan and Clara didn't rush into anything. They both understood that whatever was growing between them needed time to take root. She continued to arrive at 7:15 every morning, continued to make his coffee and prepare his meals, and keep his house running smoothly. But now there were moments of connection threaded through the routine. A lingering look across the kitchen, a brush of hands as she set down his coffee cup, a conversation that stretched long past what was necessary. Ethan found himself restructuring his days around her presence. He took his meals at the kitchen counter instead of his desk, found excuses to wander through the house while she worked, invented questions just to hear her voice. It was ridiculous. He knew. He was 43 years old, not some lovesick teenager, but he couldn't help himself. After 5 years of numbness, feeling something again was intoxicating. Clara, for her part, seemed equally off balance. Ethan caught her watching him sometimes, her expression thoughtful and wondering, as if she were trying to figure out a puzzle she'd been working on for years. She started wearing her hair down instead of in her usual practical ponytail. She laughed more easily, smiled more freely, moved through the house with a lightness that hadn't been there before. Neither of them mentioned David Chen, though Ethan thought about him often. He imagined the physical therapist waiting by his phone, wondering why Clara hadn't called about that dinner. He felt guilty about it sometimes, in the middle of the night when sleep wouldn't come. Guilty that he'd inserted himself into something that wasn't his business, that he'd potentially disrupted a connection that might have made Clara happy. But then he'd remember the way she looked at him now, the way her hand fit in his, and the guilt would fade into something that felt more like hope. It was 3 weeks after Clara's coffee date that everything changed. Ethan had been in meetings all day, tedious conference calls with investors and board members that left him drained and irritable. The product launch they'd been planning for months had hit a snag. A competitor had announced something similar, and the board was in panic mode, demanding changes and revisions that would require weeks of additional work. By the time 6 o'clock rolled around, he wanted nothing more than to retreat to his office with a glass of whiskey and forget the world existed. Instead, he found Clara waiting for him in the living room, dressed not in her usual work clothes, but in a deep burgundy dress that made his mouth go dry. The dress was simple but elegant, the kind of thing that looked effortless, but probably required hours of careful consideration. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she was wearing makeup. Subtle, barely there, but enough to highlight the warmth of her eyes and the curve of her lips. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Clara gestured to the dining room, where the table had been set with candles and flowers and the good china that Ethan had forgotten he owned. Crystal glasses sparkled in the candlelight, and the smell of something delicious wafted from the kitchen. "You've been working too hard. I thought you could use a proper dinner." Ethan stared at the scene before him, at the effort she'd put in, at the hope written plainly across her face. "Clara, this This is beautiful. It's just dinner. But she was smiling, that secret smile from weeks ago that now seemed to belong only to him. Come on. Sit down before everything gets cold. The meal was exquisite. Clara had outdone herself, creating courses that rivaled any fine restaurant in Seattle. A butternut squash soup to start, silky and perfectly seasoned. Salmon with a crispy skin and a citrus glaze that made his taste buds sing. A salad with figs and goat cheese, and a balsamic reduction that was somehow both sweet and tangy. But Ethan barely tasted the food. He was too busy watching her, cataloging every detail. The way the candlelight played across her cheekbones, the delicate silver necklace resting in the hollow of her throat, the nervous energy in her gestures that told him this mattered to her as much as it mattered to him. They talked about everything and nothing. His work troubles, her sister's new boyfriend, the book they'd both been reading, the travel destinations they'd always wanted to visit. The conversation flowed easily, the way it always did between them now. And Ethan found himself wondering how he'd ever thought of their interactions as merely professional. Over dessert, a chocolate soufflé that collapsed slightly when she brought it to the table, prompting a mortified apology that Ethan waved away. He set down his fork and reached across the table for her hand. Clara, I need to tell you something. She went still, her eyes searching his face. What is it? I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few weeks. About us. About what this is between us. He took a breath, steadying himself. I know our situation is complicated. I'm your employer. There's a power imbalance that we can't ignore, no matter how we feel about each other. And I don't want you to ever feel like you have to. Ethan. Clara's voice was gentle, but firm. I don't feel obligated. I'm not doing this because you pay my salary. I know that. But I still need to say this, because I want to do this right. He tightened his grip on her hand. If we're going to be together, really together, then things need to change. I can't be your boss, and whatever this is. It's not fair to you. Clara raised an eyebrow. Are you firing me? No, I'm asking you to quit. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Clara's expression shifted from surprise to something more complex, something Ethan couldn't quite read. You want me to quit? She said slowly. And then what? And then I'd like to take you to dinner. A real dinner, at a restaurant, where you're not the one doing the cooking. He swallowed hard. I'd like to date you, Clara. Properly, like a normal person. You're not a normal person. You're a billionaire tech CEO. And you're the woman who makes my coffee every morning and yells at me when I don't eat my eggs. I think we're past normal. Clara laughed, and the tension broke like a wave against rocks. She stood up from the table, walked around to his side, and stopped directly in front of his chair. I don't want to quit, she said. Ethan's heart sank. Oh, I understand. I shouldn't have assumed. Let me finish. Clara placed her hands on his shoulders, forcing him to look up at her. I don't want to quit because I love this job. I love taking care of this house. I love making sure you eat breakfast and don't work yourself into an early grave. That's not going to change just because we're dating. But the power dynamic is something we can figure out together. She leaned down, her face inches from his. I'm not fragile, Ethan. I'm not going to break because our relationship is complicated. I've been navigating complicated my whole life. Ethan reached up to touch her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She was so beautiful in the candlelight, so warm and real and present, so different from the grief and emptiness that had defined his existence for so long. Are you sure? He whispered. I'm sure. She smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise after 5 years of darkness. Now are you going to kiss me? Or do I have to do everything myself? He kissed her, It wasn't perfect. He was out of practice, and she was trembling slightly, and his chair scraped loudly against the floor when he stood to pull her closer. But it was real. It was true. And when Clara wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, Ethan felt something shift into place inside him, a piece he'd thought was lost forever, finally coming home. They spent the rest of that evening talking, making plans, imagining a future that neither of them had allowed themselves to consider before. Clara would continue working. She was insistent about that. But they would set boundaries, establish clear lines between their professional and personal relationships. They would take things slowly, give themselves time to adjust to this new dynamic. And they would be honest with each other, always, even when it was difficult. "I need to tell Maria," Clara said eventually, curled up against Ethan on the living room couch. The candles had burned down to stubs, and the rain had returned, drumming softly against the windows. "She's going to lose her mind." "Because you're dating your boss?" "Because I'm dating anyone. She's been trying to set me up for years. She's going to be insufferably smug about this." Ethan laughed, pulling her closer. "And David Chen." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He's a good guy. He deserves to know why I'm not interested." "I feel bad about that in a way. He never really had a chance." "No," Clara agreed. "He didn't, but that's not your fault. It was always going to be you, Ethan. From the first day I walked into this house, and you looked at me like I was the only solid thing in the whole world. I just didn't let myself believe it could go anywhere." "Why not?" She sighed, her breath warm against his chest. "Because you were grieving. Because you were my employer. Because I was afraid of wanting something I couldn't have." She tilted her head up to look at him. "But mostly because I didn't think you could ever see me as anything other than the help." The word stung, even though Ethan knew it was deserved. He'd spent 3 years treating Clara like a convenience rather than a person, never stopping to wonder about her hopes or dreams, or the life she lived outside his walls. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry for making you feel invisible." "You didn't. Not really. You were just lost. Trapped in your own pain." Clara reached up to stroke his cheek. "But you're here now. That's what matters." The weeks that followed were a revelation. Ethan discovered that falling in love, real love, not the comfortable familiarity he'd known with Sarah, but something new and unexpected and thrilling, was nothing like what the movies promised. It was messy and complicated and occasionally terrifying. It meant having difficult conversations about boundaries and expectations. It meant navigating the awkwardness of dating someone who still cleaned his house and made his meals. It meant learning to be vulnerable again after years of protecting himself from anything that might hurt. But it was also wonderful. Clara brought light into corners of his life that had been dark for so long, he'd forgotten they existed. She dragged him out of his office to watch the sunset over Puget Sound. She insisted on Sunday dinners with her sister Maria, who was indeed insufferably smug, but also warm and welcoming in a way that made Ethan miss his own family less. She made him laugh, made him think, made him want to be better than he was. And slowly, gradually, Ethan began to live again. He started delegating more at work, trusting his team to handle things that he'd always insisted on controlling himself. He signed up for a cooking class at a culinary school in Ballard, determined to learn at least a few basic dishes so that Clara didn't have to feed him constantly. The first few attempts were disasters: burned sauces, overcooked pasta, one memorable incident with a smoke alarm that brought the fire department to his door. But Clara ate everything he made with an encouraging smile that made him want to keep trying. He opened up the rooms of the house that had been closed since Sarah's death, the nursery they'd been preparing, with its half-painted walls and the crib still in its box, the garden she'd loved that had become overgrown and wild, the reading nook where they used to spend Sunday mornings with coffee and the New York Times. It was painful, revisiting these spaces filled with memories of the future they'd never have. But Clara was there beside him, holding his hand, helping him decide what to keep and what to let go. They donated the baby furniture to a shelter for young mothers. They hired a landscaper to restore the garden, keeping the roses Sarah had planted, but adding new beds that Clara designed herself. They turned the reading nook into a shared space, adding Clara's books alongside Ethan's, creating something that belonged to both of them. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, of grief that came rushing back when he least expected it. There were arguments, real arguments, loud and heated, about everything from his workaholic tendencies to Clara's stubborn independence. There was the awkward dinner party where one of Ethan's colleagues had mistaken Clara for catering staff, and the painful conversation that followed about the assumptions people would make about their relationship. "They'll think you're with me for the money," Ethan said one night, after a society event where several people had made pointed comments about gold diggers and opportunists. "They'll think you're using me, or I'm using you, or let them think whatever they want." Clara's voice was calm, but her eyes flashed with something fiercer. "I don't care what strangers believe. I know the truth. You know the truth. That's all that matters." "But, Ethan..." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "I spent my whole life worrying about what other people thought. About whether I was good enough, smart enough, ambitious enough. I'm done with that. I'm done letting other people's opinions dictate how I live my life." She kissed him softly. "I love you. You love me. Everything else is noise." And eventually, after enough time, enough evidence, enough glimpses of the real relationship beneath the assumptions, the noise began to fade. 6 months after that first kiss in the dining room, Ethan took Clara to Paris. It wasn't a grand gesture. He'd learned by now that Clara didn't need or want those. It was simply a vacation, a chance to escape Seattle's perpetual rain and spend a week exploring a city neither of them had ever visited. They wandered through the Louvre until their feet ached, marveling at artwork they'd only seen in books. They ate croissants for breakfast and cheese for lunch, and elaborate multi-course dinners in tiny restaurants where the waiters pretended not to speak English. They got hopelessly lost in the winding streets of Montmartre and stumbled upon a street musician playing jazz standards that made Clara cry. They held hands on the Pont des Arts, where lovers used to hang locks before the bridge nearly collapsed under their weight. They argued about whether the tourist trap restaurants were worth it. Clara said no, they were overpriced, and the food was mediocre. Ethan paid for one anyway, and admitted she'd been right. They stayed in a small hotel in the Marais, where the elevator was too tiny for their luggage, and the view from their window looked out over a cobblestone courtyard that seemed untouched by time. On their last night in the city, they had dinner at a bistro near the Seine, the kind of place that didn't have menus, because the chef made whatever was fresh that day. Clara was radiant in the candlelight, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes bright with wine and happiness. "I have something for you," Ethan said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Clara's expression turned wary. "Ethan, we talked about this. No expensive gifts." "It's not expensive." He placed a small velvet box on the table between them. "Well, not very expensive. Just open it." She reached for the box slowly, as if expecting it to explode. Inside was a simple silver key on a delicate chain. Nothing flashy, nothing ostentatious, just a key. "What is this?" "It's the key to the house. Not a spare key for work. You already have that. This is..." Ethan took a breath, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since the early days of building his company. "This is me asking you to stay. For real. Not as my housekeeper. Not as someone who shows up at 7:15 and leaves at 6. As my partner. As the person I come home to." Clara stared at the key, her expression unreadable. "You want me to move in with you?" "I want you to live with me. There's a difference." Ethan reached across the table to take her hand. "I know it's a lot to ask. I know we've only been together for 6 months. But Clara, I wake up every morning, and the first thing I think about is you. I go to sleep every night wishing you were there. I don't want to wait anymore. I don't want to pretend that what we have is anything less than what it is. And what is it? It's everything. You're everything." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, fear and hope warring for dominance. He'd pushed too hard, asked for too much. She was going to say no, and then... Yes. The word was so soft he almost missed it. "Yes?" he repeated. "Yes." Clara looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll live with you. Yes to all of it, Ethan. Yes to everything." He was out of his chair before he knew what he was doing, pulling her into his arms and kissing her while the other diners watched and smiled, and the waiter discreetly retreated to give them privacy. Clara laughed against his mouth, happy and surprised and utterly beautiful. "I love you," Ethan said, the words coming easily now when once they'd been impossible. "I love you, Clara Reyes." "I love you too." She pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face. "I've loved you for longer than I wanted to admit. Even when you were a disaster who didn't eat breakfast and worked until midnight. Even then." "Even then?" "Especially then." She kissed him again, soft and sweet. "You needed someone, and I wanted to be that someone. It just took us both a while to figure it out." They returned to Seattle as a couple, officially and openly. There were adjustments to be made. Clara moved her things into the house, transforming Ethan's sterile bachelor quarters into something that actually felt like a home. She brought color and warmth, potted plants that thrived under her care, photographs of her family and friends, the small personal touches that made a house into something more. She took on a new role in his company, using her hospitality degree to manage the executive staff services, a position Ethan created specifically for her, with a salary and benefits and a clear separation from their personal relationship. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when old habits crept in, when Clara reached for the vacuum out of instinct, or Ethan forgot that she wasn't obligated to make his coffee anymore. But they navigated each awkwardness with patience and humor. Maria threw them a party to celebrate, cramming 40 of her closest friends into her tiny Portland apartment, and introducing Ethan to the extended Reyes family with a glee that bordered on vindictive. "She's been waiting for this for years," Clara whispered, as they watched Maria direct relatives toward the buffet table with the authority of a traffic cop. "Fair warning, she's going to ask about grandchildren before the night is over." "Grandchildren? Not for us, for her. She has a theory that if I'm settled down, she won't feel guilty about not settling down herself." Ethan laughed. "That's not how that works. Try telling her that." But the party was wonderful, filled with warmth and noise and the kind of chaotic family energy that Ethan's own upbringing had lacked. He found himself drawn into conversation with Clara's uncles, who grilled him about his intentions and his politics, and whether he knew anything about cars. He helped Clara's cousin wrestle her toddler into a high chair. He watched Clara across the room, laughing with old friends, gesturing expressively, so fully herself in a way she rarely was in Seattle's polished social circles. This was who she was, he realized. Not the polished housekeeper, not the elegant woman who managed his life, but this vibrant, loving person surrounded by people who adored her. And somehow, impossibly, she'd chosen him. A year after their trip to Paris, Ethan proposed. Not with a grand gesture. Clara had been very clear about her feelings on those. But in the garden she'd brought back to life, surrounded by the flowers she'd planted and the life they'd built together. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of perfect Seattle day that felt like a gift after months of rain. The roses were blooming, pink and red and white, and the air smelled of coffee from the pot Clara had made before they'd wandered outside. Ethan got down on one knee in the dirt, ruining a pair of pants that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and asked her to marry him. The ring was simple. A vintage piece he'd found in an antique shop in Pioneer Square, with a small diamond surrounded by tiny sapphires. Nothing flashy, nothing ostentatious. Just beautiful, like Clara herself. Clara said yes before he'd even finished the question. The wedding was small, held in Maria's backyard on a sunny October afternoon. Clara wore a simple white dress that she'd found at a vintage shop in Portland, and Ethan wore a suit that his mother would have complained wasn't formal enough. There were maybe 30 guests: Clara's family, a handful of Ethan's closest friends, the people who had watched them fumble toward each other and cheered them on. When they exchanged vows, Ethan found himself thinking about everything that had led to this moment, the grief that had nearly destroyed him, the woman who had quietly, persistently saved him without ever asking for anything in return, the morning when she'd announced that she had a date, and everything he thought he knew about his life had fallen apart. "I was so afraid," he admitted in his vows, Clara's hands clasped in his. "Afraid of feeling again, afraid of losing again. But you made me brave, Clara. You showed me that love wasn't something to be avoided, but something to be embraced, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." Clara's eyes were bright with tears, but her smile was steady. "You were never a project," she said in return. "You were never someone I needed to fix. You were always exactly who you were supposed to be, a good man who forgot for a while how to live. All I did was remind you." The kiss that sealed their marriage tasted like possibility, like second chances, like the best kind of surprise. They honeymooned in Portugal, Clara's choice, a connection to heritage she'd never had the chance to explore. Her grandmother had been born in a small village near Porto, and though she died before Clara was born, the stories had been passed down through generations. They rented a car and drove along the coast, stopping at tiny villages and hidden beaches, eating fresh seafood and drinking local wine, and discovering places that felt like they belonged in a fairy tale. They found Clara's grandmother's village, a collection of whitewashed houses clinging to a hillside overlooking the Atlantic. The church where she'd been baptized was still standing, and the old women in the square remembered her family name. They visited the cemetery and found her grave, marked with a simple stone that had weathered decades of salt air. Clara knelt beside it and wept, and Ethan held her, and somehow this moment of grief felt like healing rather than pain. "Thank you," Clara said later, as they watched the sunset from their hotel balcony, "for bringing me here, for understanding why this mattered." "It's your history," Ethan said simply. "It's part of who you are." "It is." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd get to see it. I always assumed there wouldn't be time, or money, or I don't know. That it was a dream for someone else." "Nothing is for someone else anymore," Ethan said. "Everything is for us. Whatever we want, wherever we want to go. The world is ours, Clara. Let's explore it." And they did. Over the next few years, they traveled together whenever they could. Japan and Italy and Australia and Iceland, places Ethan had always wanted to visit, and places Clara had only dreamed about. They learned to scuba dive in Thailand, hiked through Patagonia, spent a month in a rented villa in Tuscany, learning to make fresh pasta from an 80-year-old grandmother who spoke no English, but communicated everything through the language of flour and eggs. But they always came home to Seattle, to the house that had once been a monument to Ethan's grief and had become something new, something alive. Clara's influence was everywhere now, in the artwork on the walls, the spices in the kitchen, the garden that had transformed from a memorial to a celebration. Friends gathered there for dinner parties and holiday celebrations. Maria visited frequently, always with a new boyfriend and a new scheme for world domination. The house that had been too quiet for so long was finally filled with noise and laughter and life. And then, 2 years after their wedding, Clara told Ethan she was pregnant. She did it the way she did everything, directly without fanfare, over breakfast one ordinary Tuesday morning. "I'm going to need you to sit down," she said, setting a plate of eggs in front of him, "and maybe put down your coffee." Ethan frowned. "Is everything okay?" "Everything is fine." Clara took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." The coffee cup slipped from Ethan's fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor. Neither of them moved to clean it up. They just stared at each other, the weight of the word hanging between them. "Pregnant," Ethan repeated. "About 6 weeks. I took 3 tests just to be sure." Clara's voice was steady, but he could see the tremor in her hands. "I know we talked about whether we wanted children, and we said we'd see how things went, and I know this is unexpected, but—" Ethan was out of his chair before she could finish, crossing the kitchen in 3 strides and pulling her into his arms. "We're having a baby," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "We're having a baby," Clara confirmed, her face buried against his chest. Is this okay? Okay?" Ethan pulled back to look at her, and he realized with surprise that there were tears streaming down his face. "Clara, this is everything. This is more than I ever thought I'd have again." They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the kitchen, the broken coffee cup forgotten on the floor. Outside, the Seattle rain began to fall, and inside, everything had changed. The pregnancy was not without complications. Clara was 37 by then, and her doctor monitored her closely, insisting on regular appointments and tests that made both of them nervous. There were false alarms, moments of panic when something seemed wrong, rushed trips to the hospital that turned out to be nothing serious. Ethan discovered a capacity for worry that he hadn't known existed, a terror at the thought of losing this fragile miracle they'd been given. But Clara was strong. She'd always been strong, and pregnancy didn't change that. She worked until her 8th month, refusing to be coddled, insisting on continuing her duties at Mercer Technologies until her doctor finally ordered bed rest. Even then, she ran the household from their bedroom, directing operations like a general commanding troops from her bunker. "You need to rest," Ethan said, for what felt like the 100th time, watching her answer emails on her laptop while propped up against a mountain of pillows. "I am resting. I'm lying down." "You're working." "Working is restful for me." Clara shot him a look. "Sitting here doing nothing is what's driving me crazy." Ethan sighed. "What can I do?" Clara's expression softened. "Sit with me. Read to me. Tell me about your day." She patted the bed beside her. "Being pregnant isn't the problem, Ethan. Being alone is the problem. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people, and now I'm stuck in this room like Rapunzel in her tower." So Ethan rearranged his schedule. He moved his home office into their bedroom, setting up a desk by the window where he could work while Clara rested. He read to her in the evenings, novels and poetry and articles about parenting that made them both laugh and cry. He held her hand when the baby kicked, marveling at the miracle of life growing beneath her skin. And when the time came, he was there. Their daughter was born on a rainy March morning, in the same Seattle hospital where Ethan had sat vigil by Sarah's bedside all those years ago. The labor was long and difficult, and there was a moment, a terrible moment, when the monitors started beeping and the doctors rushed in, and Ethan felt his heart stop beating in his chest. But Clara was strong. She'd always been strong. And when the doctors finally placed their daughter in her arms, both of them sobbing with relief and joy and exhaustion, Ethan understood what it meant to feel truly, completely alive. They named her Elena, after Clara's grandmother. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and from the moment she took her first breath, she had them both wrapped around her tiny finger. Fatherhood changed Ethan in ways he hadn't expected. He'd thought, after Sarah, that he'd lost the capacity for that kind of love, the fierce, protective, overwhelming love of a parent for a child. But Elena proved him wrong. He learned to change diapers and give baths, to soothe cries at 3 a.m. and marvel at the impossibly small fingers that grasped his own. He learned that exhaustion could coexist with joy, that frustration could live alongside wonder. Clara was an extraordinary mother. She brought the same competence and warmth to parenting that she'd brought to everything else, managing the chaos of new parenthood with a grace that made it look easy even when it wasn't. She sang Spanish lullabies that her own mother had sung to her, and she insisted on traditions that blended both of their families: Christmas tamales from Maria's recipe, holiday dinners that incorporated dishes from Ethan's New England childhood. They hired help, of course. Ethan could afford it, and Clara was wise enough to know that martyrdom wasn't nobility. A nanny for the weekdays, a housekeeper to take over the duties Clara had performed for so long. But the important moments were always theirs. First steps and first words, bedtime stories and morning cuddles. And through it all, they held on to each other. They fought and made up and learned to navigate the new terrain of their lives. They found moments for themselves. Date nights when the baby stayed with Maria. Weekend mornings when the nanny came early and they had an hour to remember what it felt like to be just the two of them. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked one night, when Elena was 3 and they were lying in bed listening to the rain. "Any of it?" Ethan turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, your life was so simple before me, before Elena. You knew exactly what each day would look like. Simple isn't the same as good. I know, but sometimes," Clara sighed, "sometimes I wonder if you miss the quiet." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously the way he always did with Clara. She deserved his honesty, always. "I miss some things," he admitted. "I miss being able to work without interruption. I miss sleeping through the night. I miss the freedom of not having to worry about anyone but myself." Clara nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "But," Ethan continued, reaching over to take her hand, "I don't miss the emptiness. I don't miss the gray. I don't miss feeling like I was just marking time until I died." He brought her hand to his lips. "You woke me up, Clara. You and Elena. You gave me reasons to be alive. I wouldn't trade that for all the quiet in the world." Clara's eyes glistened in the darkness. "I love you. I love you too." He pulled her close, breathing in the jasmine scent of her hair. "I will always love you, no matter what." On their 5th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Clara back to Paris. They left Elena with Maria for the week, a decision that had required extensive negotiations and several sleepless nights of second-guessing, and returned to the city where everything had shifted from possible to real. They stayed at the same hotel in the Marais, ate at the same bistro by the Seine, walked the same streets they'd wandered years before. But everything was different now. They were different. The tentative couple who'd taken their first steps toward a shared life had become something solid, something permanent. "Do you remember," Clara asked, leaning against the railing of the Pont des Arts, "what you said to me when we first talked about being together, about how you wanted to do things properly?" "I said I wanted to take you to dinner like a normal person." "Right, and I said you weren't a normal person." Ethan laughed. "You also said I was a billionaire tech CEO, as if that was some kind of disqualifying factor." "It was a concern." Clara turned to face him, the lights of the city sparkling in her eyes. "I was worried, you know, that it wouldn't work, that the differences between us would be too big, that you'd wake up one day and realize you'd made a mistake. And now?" Clara smiled, that secret smile that still made his heart skip after all these years. "Now I know better. Now I know that love isn't about being the same. It's about choosing each other, every day, despite the differences." She reached up to touch his face, her palm warm against his cheek. "You chose me, Ethan. When you could have had anyone, when you could have stayed safe and numb and alone, you chose me. And I will never stop being grateful for that." "I didn't choose you," Ethan said softly. Not really. You were inevitable. From the moment you walked into my house and started bossing me around, I never had a chance." Clara laughed, bright and free, and Ethan kissed her while the city sparkled around them. They had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, a grieving widower and his housekeeper, separated by money and class, and the expectations of everyone around them. They had built something beautiful from the wreckage of loss and fear and the walls they'd each constructed around their hearts. And they would keep building, keep choosing, keep loving, tomorrow and all the tomorrows after. Because that was what love meant in the end. Not the grand gestures or the perfect moments, but the daily decision to show up, to be present, to hold on even when it was hard. Clara had taught him that, and Ethan intended to spend the rest of his life proving he'd learned the lesson well. Years later, when their daughter was grown and had children of her own, people would ask them how they'd managed to make it work. A billionaire and his housekeeper. It sounded like the plot of a romance novel. Too perfect to be true. Clara would smile, that secret smile that belonged only to her, and say that it wasn't perfect, that it was work, every single day, choosing each other over and over again. That love wasn't a destination, but a journey, and they were still walking it together. And Ethan would add that it all started with a cup of coffee, a rainy Seattle morning, and a woman brave enough to tell him she had a date. The woman who changed everything, the woman who saved his life, the woman who made him believe against all evidence that happy endings were possible, not just in fairy tales, but in the real world, for real people who were willing to take a chance on love. Elena grew up surrounded by that love, watching her parents dance in the kitchen, listening to them argue about politics and make up with laughter, seeing the way her father looked at her mother like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. She learned that love wasn't always easy, that it required work and patience, and the willingness to forgive. But she also learned that it was worth it, that finding someone who saw you, really saw you, past all the masks and defenses, was the greatest gift life could offer. And when she was grown, with children of her own, she would tell them the story of how her parents met, about the grieving widower and the housekeeper who refused to let him disappear, about the coffee date that never happened, and the jealousy that finally opened his eyes, about the courage it took to reach for happiness when it seemed like the riskiest thing in the world. "Your grandmother changed everything," she would say, watching her children's eyes grow wide with wonder. She walked into that house when Grandpa was at his lowest point, and she just stayed. She made him coffee and eggs and forced him to eat when he wanted to give up. And then one day, she told him she had a date, and he realized that the best thing in his life had been standing right beside him all along. "Did they live happily ever after?" her daughter would ask. Elena would smile, the same secret smile her mother had passed down to her. "They chose each other," she would say. "Every single day they chose each other. And in the end, that was better than any fairy tale." The Seattle house still stood, decades later, though it had changed over the years. Elena had inherited it when her parents passed, within 6 months of each other, because neither could bear to live in a world without the other. She'd kept the garden Clara had planted, added new flowers for her own children to tend. The kitchen still smelled of coffee in the mornings, and sometimes, when the rain was falling in that particular way it did in the Pacific Northwest, Elena could almost hear her mother humming Spanish lullabies, and her father laughing at something she'd said. The story of Ethan and Clara Mercer became something of a legend in their family. The tale of two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life from the wreckage of grief and the courage to love again. It was told at weddings and anniversary parties, passed down from generation to generation like a cherished heirloom. And every time Elena told it, she ended the same way. "My father used to say that love wasn't something you fell into. It was something you chose. Every morning when you woke up, every evening when you went to sleep, you had to decide, is this person worth the effort, worth the compromise, worth the risk of getting hurt. She would pause, looking at her audience, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, whoever had gathered to hear the story again. And for him, the answer was always yes. For both of them, the answer was always yes. But how did they know? Someone would inevitably ask. How did they know it would work out? Elena would smile, the same smile her mother had worn all those years ago, the secret one, the one that held mysteries and promises and the quiet certainty of a life well lived. They didn't know, she would say. That's the whole point. Love isn't about certainty, it's about choosing someone anyway, despite the fear, despite the risk, despite all the ways it could go wrong. My parents taught me that. They taught all of us that. And then she would look out the window, at the rain falling on the garden her mother had planted, and she would remember. She would remember her father reading bedtime stories with different voices for each character. She would remember her mother dancing in the kitchen, pulling everyone into her orbit with that infectious joy. She would remember the way they looked at each other, even after decades together, like they were still amazed that they'd found each other, still grateful for every day they had. That was the real legacy of Ethan and Clara Mercer. Not the money or the company, or even the beautiful house overlooking Puget Sound. The real legacy was the love they'd modeled for their children and grandchildren. Messy, complicated, sometimes difficult, but always worth fighting for. And it had all started with a simple sentence, spoken on a rainy Seattle morning by a woman brave enough to be honest about her life. I have a date. 4 little words that had changed everything. That had woken a grieving man from his slumber and shown him that happiness wasn't something you had to earn or deserve. It was something you had to reach for, with both hands, and hold on tight. Clara had reached for him, and Ethan had reached back. And together, they had built something beautiful, something that would last forever. In the end, the greatest love stories aren't about perfection. They're about 2 imperfect people who refuse to give up on each other. They're about showing up day after day, even when it's hard. They're about choosing love when fear would be easier, about reaching for connection when isolation feels safer. Ethan Mercer learned that lesson in a kitchen in Seattle, from a woman who made his coffee and forced him to eat breakfast, and refused to let him disappear into his grief. Clara Reyes taught him that healing wasn't a destination, but a process. That moving forward didn't mean leaving the past behind. It meant carrying it with you, letting it make you stronger instead of breaking you down. And together, they proved that love could bloom in the most unexpected places. That second chances were possible, even when you'd given up hope. That the person who knows you best might be standing right beside you, waiting for you to open your eyes and see them. Have you ever realized that the person who knows you best has been standing right beside you all along? If you haven't, maybe it's time to look.